Okay, without further ado, Jared, take it away. And we can see your screen.
Oh my God, it works. It usually doesn't. So, yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jared Bhatti. I am a technical writer at Waymo. I've been a writer within Alphabet for the past 15 years. I've worked on a tremendous number of projects, such as Google's data center buildouts, Google Cloud, AdSense, and now Waymo. I've also contributed to a number of projects at the Linux Foundation, specifically Kubernetes. So I'm here to talk a bit about just my book, Docs for Developers, and a bit about technical writing, and giving some of the basics about how to share knowledge, how to approach writing within your own organizations, especially if you're not sure where to begin and you feel like it hurts a bit. So
yes, and Jared, I would definitely bring up too the fact that this is a career path for people, that the need for technical writers right now, you guys, has exploded. Even in San Luis Obispo at Amazon.com, that is one of the positions that I see frequently on their job listing, is technical writers. So I didn't realize it was actually such a significant career path for techies who may not want to go the full-blown developer route. But maybe, Jared, tell us a little bit about how you got into it.
And just for like context, yeah, great. And feel free to interrupt me at any time during this presentation. If I don't get to the end, I've shared slides with everybody here. But yeah, my background's in electrical engineering and computer science, and I have a minor in English composition. I did a lot of work as an electrical engineer and realized I actually preferred writing about technology than I actually did building technology. I also just love sitting down and talking with engineers and getting all their ideas onto paper and then clarifying it for other audiences. Because, I like getting into the technical nitty-gritty and all the trade-offs, but I also want people to understand and respect the work that we as technologists do. So that's how I got into technical writing. And I pretty much stumbled into the field because there really aren't a lot of formal programs to teach technical writing. So I had interdisciplinary degrees to do this work. But honestly, I was doing work at a startup, and the startup tanked like they do in San Francisco. And I put my resume on Craigslist in 2006, and a recruiter from Google reached out to me and said, hey, I think you might be a really good fit as a technical writer. And I was like, that sounds great. When can I interview? So came in and interviewed, and they accepted me. And I've been at Google for the past 15 years.
If that's not a Cinderella story, I don't know what is.
So yeah, I don't know if Craigslist will work quite the same way these days, but it worked for me.
Congrats.
Thanks. Yeah, and feel free to jump in and interrupt at any point. This presentation is fairly high level and pretty quick, and I have tons of room for Q&A at the end. So, just quick lay of the land. Also, are you seeing the slide mode or the? Oh yeah, I'll give you the slides.
You're good. We're seeing slide mode.
If you want to follow along, short link is bit.ly/TB docs for devs spelled out. You're welcome to follow along. But just giving a quick introduction of who I am, who our authors are, inspiration for what encouraged us to write this book, how to start writing on your own for some of the projects that you might be leading or developing, and then just a thanks book plug Q&A. So getting into who we are, I already gave a quick introduction of who I am. Google Waymo technical writer. I've led multiple teams of writers, and as Brian said, we are hiring. I think we have positions open for about 30 writers within Google, and I'm personally hiring another 2 within Waymo. So there is a ton of space for hiring here. Zach, these are my co-authors who work at various other organizations. So Zach Quillison, who managed documentation at the Linux Foundation and is now lead writer at Stripe. Jen Lamborn, who worked on a lot of the documentation around sort of technical standards at the EU and now works at Monzo Bank. Dave Nunez, who's a docs manager at Stripe, and Heidi Waterhouse, who's a developer at Launch Darkly. We are all hiring. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Brian was hinting at, the inspiration for the book. There's a huge need for technical writers, and a lot of that is because as we build systems that are more and more complex, we need to understand what those systems are in order to use them and integrate with them. You might be building tools, systems yourself, and need to get your users to use them in a particular way, maybe avoid using them in a particular way. And it seems like documentation is often something that is neglected and underinvested in, even though it's incredibly important for both you as a team or as an engineer that might be learning a new project, and as your users who are looking for information. So, vast majority of developers and engineers identify incomplete documentation as a huge problem within the industry. And developers and engineers look for documentation not only as sort of the guidance for how to do something, but also for as a means of understanding whether or not they're going to adopt the technology. Technology that doesn't have documentation is less likely to be adopted. And I think a lot of companies tend to index on providing support and live support, and most developers prefer consulting documentation. So I have sources for all these. They're in the slides. Feel free to take a look at them. Those are from the GitHub surveys that go out to developers and State of the Octoverse and Google State of DevOps surveys. So these are surveys of thousands of developers and how they evaluate documentation, just how they approach programming in general. So teams with quality documentation usually see a 50% bump in productivity. They're 2.5 times more likely to develop better software. They're likely to develop better security practices. They have better reliability practices. So based on surveys that have been done in the industry, documentation is incredibly important. But there's this qualifier here that is quality documentation. And what does quality documentation really mean? So, need to go back one. And again, so quality documentation is documentation that's helpful, accurate, and organized. So, this might be fairly straightforward, but it's really good to just highlight what we're talking about when we talk about good docs. So it helps the user accomplish the specific goal that they're trying to do. It doesn't just discuss what the technology is or the underlying framework that and the decisions that were made to build it, but it also helps the user get to where they want to go. In addition to being accurate and being able to be found in search. So how do you actually go about writing quality documentation? Especially, when we spoke to developers about this, developers actually had a deep need and desire to write documentation, but what they wanted was for us to get to the basics, to sort of define a process for creating quality documentation. And so, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel and really get too complicated with this. So the process, loosely, is just starting out with, who are you when you're writing? So starting with, you're probably an engineer, you're working on a new feature or maybe a new API that you are trying to deliver to a specific group of people. Now, this might be internal documentation as well, where you're developing a new piece of hardware or specific tool, or like at Waymo, it might be a new LiDAR system, where we're developing this, but we also want other internal users to use them. And as the person who developed this particular technology, you have this deep understanding of what the technology is. And to some degree, this is a benefit, but it's also a curse. So you might have heard of the curse of knowledge, where you know so much about a particular subject, or in this case, a feature or piece of technology, that you can't simplify it for your audience. And this is the curse of a lot of pieces of documentation, and a lot of issues where developers sit down and look at a blank page and don't know where to start. So it's useful to write down, like, hey, who are you? What are you, like, what's your knowledge? But then also, who is your audience? What do they need? Your audience might just be trying to authenticate with your API. In the case of Waymo, they might be trying to install a LiDAR system on one of our new Jaguars, or take that data from the LiDAR system and generate sort of a view of the world from it. How do they do that? So it's breaking down the technology into just what the end user's goals are. And once you define those goals, you can start to list them out. So, like, what are the specific goals that people are trying to do? Which goals are the most important that you should address? And when you start working through these, you can start writing a story. So the image go away. So just for context, there is a story that's woven throughout our book that's about a company that's developing a dog bark translator. So if you happen to like cartoons of corgis, our book has tons of them in it. But it's really useful to sort of write out the story or the user journey that your audience is trying to accomplish when they're using your particular piece of technology. Because your piece, like whatever you're developing, should solve a problem for your audience, and you should document what that is. And this could be a simple, like, few bullets in a bulleted list, but it's useful to jot that down. And then looking at that list, look at where it hurts the most for your user. Because I think this is actually the most important thing to take away, is that your documentation, whatever you write, should solve the biggest pain point for your audience. So if authenticating to your API is a pain in the butt, then that's probably the first thing you should document. Or maybe with Kubernetes, when I was documenting that, it's a very complex, fairly difficult to understand, jargon heavy piece of infrastructure. So maybe breaking that down in a simple to understand way is the most useful pain point to address first. But focusing on the pain is a good place to start for your documentation. And then once you outline what this sort of particular pain point is that you're trying to address, you can start creating content around, like, okay, how do you navigate this? Like, what do you want to build? If you're doing that authentication with a particular API, well, how do you do it? How do you get your API keys? How do you do that authentication step? You can document that. And if you're addressing a particular pain point, that's the most important pain point for your users, it doesn't have to be the greatest document ever written. It simply has to be good enough. I definitely run into developers and engineers who are very perfectionistic about their documentation. And as a technical writer, that's something I can definitely get into. But when you work with engineers who are creating those sort of first drafts that come out, that's not the goal. The goal is to simply be good enough. And then if you have, say, a code review process, you can then use that to do your editing. You can do peer editing, have a coworker give you feedback, bring in editing possibly from like, if there's a member of your audience that's willing to take a look at your document and give you feedback on that, you can integrate that feedback, and then publish it and move on. So, overall, the timeline of doing this work is basically gathering your knowledge about your audience, their needs, triaging that information to find the most salient pain points that you want to address, and then documenting those, writing quickly a good enough doc, and then reviewing it. And then once you deliver it, you publish it, get feedback, and iterate. And the goal is for this to be very similar to how you push code. So this is often called a docs-like code approach, where I use the exact same systems to publish documentation that I use to write code.
No, I mean the pan is cooking it.
Oh, okay. Wasn't sure if that was a question or not. So, like I was saying, I use the exact same tools to write documentation as I used to write code. I write in an IDE, I publish in a source code control system, and all of the major tech companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and I think every open source project in the Linux Foundation uses a similar model.
Jared, can you use GitHub?
Oh yeah. When I worked on Kubernetes and did work on the Linux Foundation, that's all on GitHub.
So everything
I think Microsoft,
right? So you can do the whole technical writing process in GitHub.
Yep. So the typical tech stack is like GitHub, static site generator, usually something like Jekyll, and then publishing content that way using that static site generator. So super common. I think Microsoft uses that model, uses that exact tech stack. So,
and developers know how to navigate that. So it helps.
Yeah.
And you're putting the documentation where they're already at.
Exactly. And that's really important, to be where they are so that they find it, they contribute to it, you're in conversation with them. And it requires, knowing that tool, knowing those tools, knowing that tech stack in order to do that work. So there's no additional tools, complicated workflows. I'm not here to sell you any additional documentation platform. All the tools that you have will work for what you need. Oop. So it's important to also know when to get help. I think if you are like, this is where, people like myself and my co-authors and other people in the community can assist if you run into issues where, you are like, if you're a smaller team or you don't have professional tech writers on staff, you're always welcome to reach out to communities like Write the Docs, which I can link to at the end of this presentation, which is specifically focused on technical documentation for developer communities. It's about 15,000 people scattered across the globe who really focus on this, and we have annual conferences. But if you're doing things like maybe translating into multiple languages or dealing with many versions of your software and maintaining different sets of documentation for them, or really focusing on a new set of users for a new set of projects that you're launching, these are all places where this process still works. This is what we as professional technical writers do, but you might want to engage with, a professional writer, either through the community for help and guidance, or, hire one of us to help you do what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And I'll also just like add a little caveat here, Brad, based on your question of, there's one thing that I would say not do. I think there is a typical, sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction when you need documentation to create a new tool that will help you do it. And I would actually the most important thing to do is to try writing and drafting good enough documentation, and to focus on your audience, and not to create new tools that might create more problems for you. Sometimes if your system's already broken and undocumented, then automating that is not going to help you very much. So I've definitely advised several groups against that when I first joined them. So that's,
you mean they were like building their own FAQ system or something?
Right. So they're building their own FAQ system, or maybe like, oh, we don't need to document how to get started. We're just going to have a really great coding sandbox that people can play with. And it's like, okay, you still need the documentation, and then build that sandbox down the road. Or like, maybe you want to focus on just creating a few like really solid video tutorials, and avoid investing a ton of engineers' time to build this sandbox that might be buggy and might have issues.
Well, and that's what was my biggest question is, when does this tech writing become a tutorial? Like, once you start doing a tutorial, you're not really doing tech writing anymore, right? Or are they the same?
No, I think that is technical writing. I mean, I didn't get into document types and creating a documentation plan, but part of understanding your audience's pain and how you need to address it is understanding what kind of content they need. And so the book goes into when to create videos or diagrams or images or different types of documentation. So a tutorial is a type of documentation. Sort of helping people procedurally, step by step, get something done. I think that's very much documentation, and that's something that I've definitely done in my career. In fact, I think that's like the bread and butter of what I do. That's like 80% of my job.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's really encouraging, because I've been doing this for years and just working learning my way through it. I developed a software called PubWriter, which is a static website generator. And I went through the whole process of generating, tutorial after tutorial, but you're right. You got to understand who it is who's watching your tutorial, get some feedback, make sure they're using it. And I did go to that sandbox. I have a sandbox on my website as well. So I'm doing like everything you're kind of advising against a little bit. It makes sense to me, and I use it. Like, if it works for me, why doesn't it work for everyone else?
Well, I think that's also an important thing to evaluate is what is it that your audience needs and wants? And one of the things, like I've really only touched on maybe the first third of the book in this presentation at a very high level. There's also, like I said, specific doc types, specific formats of information, but also how to organize it, how to, understand if it's actually working or not, how to gather metrics on it, and then of course how to maintain it and deprecate it over time. So there's a whole process of maintaining content. It's very similar to launching and maintaining features in code. So there's that. I mean, I think you should use the format that works for your audience. And it sounds like when you say tutorial, like when I think tutorial, I think it could be in any format. Like it could be a document that's simply a numbered list, 1 through 10, do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But it sounds like you're also describing maybe a video or
a sandbox tutorial would be where I show you how to do it and then you do it. I show you how to do it and then you do it. And I mean, that's the hands-on tutorials are the best I like.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think one thing that I would point out is that if you're using video or interactive tutorials, like if you push a new feature or you have to update something, then you also have to make sure that it updates across all these systems.
Yes.
And if you're a small group of engineers, or if maybe you're the only person building it, then you have to evaluate like, okay, what's the maintenance cost of this?
Yes.
Versus, if it's just a numbered list, that can be equally effective, but yet the maintenance costs can be much smaller. So that's something to consider every time you choose a format. And video and interactive tutorials are both very maintenance heavy.
Yeah, and screenshots can be the killer, right? Because the platform changes and now all of a sudden, and I see this all the time. I'm using a piece of software which is still relatively new, and the screenshots that I'm looking at the tutorial don't match what I'm using. So they've made some changes, and like you said, they haven't gone back and redid the tutorials.
Yeah, it could be a big maintenance burden. And at the same time, just if you think, if you spend more time carefully considering what you're naming things within your UI, then as they change, if the naming is still the same, then you can just rely on that naming of like, go to this particular menu, open this particular feature. But if you have to rely on screenshots, which frankly users do like, then you're setting yourself up for some maintenance pain. But understanding those trade-offs is really important. It's easy to just sort of generate 50 docs that have a ton of screenshots and then think, maybe I'll get to this later. And then they, rapidly decay.
Yep. Excellent. All right. Who else has questions for Jared? This is a golden opportunity.
Hey, Jared, Jim Wilson here. I wanted to ask you, is there a preferred tool when evaluating what doc to create for a technical resource? So are you leveraging something like Google Analytics and looking at maybe traffic on an existing quick FAQ that is really fitting the bill for your audience? Or are you looking at maybe something like Hotjar and seeing what is more traffic when it comes to your existing documentation? How do you evaluate and prioritize what docs get created or updated?
Good question. So I tend to look at, I'll holistically look at documentation using generally Google Analytics. So what's being visited the most, what's being visited the least? Are there specific triggers that people are hitting? When I was working on, say, App Engine or Google Cloud, like, are people signing up for, a VM or an instance of App Engine? Like, I will look at that button click and also evaluate how many pages that they're looking at when it comes to setting up various tutorials. I also will look at different types of pages because there isn't one success metric for all of your documentation. So for example, I have getting started guides for a lot of the products that I documented, just how to quickly, within 5 minutes, get started doing something with this particular product. And those I'm actually looking at how do people complete them and how quickly. I want those to be front and center. I want people to hit those as much as possible. Whereas API pages or even troubleshooting pages, I'm going to look at, and like a troubleshooting page, I'm like, oh, this is getting a lot of hits. Oh, maybe there's a specific issue that I need to get back to the engineering team with, because it seems like a lot of people are having this particular issue. But short answer is I lean heavily on Google Analytics. So specific cases, clusters of metrics, which I go into, but that's sort of like hey, here's the nuanced approach to doing analytics. And yeah. Does that answer your question?
You need to shut the fuck.
Whoa, hello.
I gotta be quick on that mute button, baby.
Yeah. Would have been bad, Joe.
Joe, you're gonna be banned from TechBrew. We know who you are. All right. Any other questions for Jared? I have more, but I want to give you guys the opportunity because it's not fair for me to be bogarting all that time.
Hi, Jared. This is Adele Summers. Sorry, I've just joined by phone at the beginning of your talk. I wanted to say howdy and thank you for giving a talk on this excellent subject. I've been cheerleading the San Luis Obispo Technical and Business Communicators group, started as a Society for Technical Communication, STC organization, almost 20 years now. And it's great to have a talk from you. I don't even live in San Luis Obispo anymore, but I still put out a newsletter every month for folks that are on our mailing list. And you mentioned that you had some job openings. If you would like to provide me with any of that information, I'd be glad to disseminate that in the newsletter, which includes all kinds of career resources and opportunities and all kinds of educational links to videos and events, including this one. So I'd be more than happy to forward those along if you'd like to round up some more candidates for your openings.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'd definitely love to talk.
You guys have a Slack channel, right, Jared?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on the Write the Docs Slack, or my contact information is also in this this presentation. So
you have an email account, or just I can just get that from wherever you have that information.
Yeah, you're welcome to email me. It's just first initial last name at Gmail.
Okay. Great. I'll be glad to do that. And I just wanted to tag on to what you were saying as well about or add on some additional comments about this. The technical communication field is really quite broad. It's enormous, actually. When you think about it, lots of folks do get in through the avenue that you were describing. They've, started off with software engineering, but decided to gravitate toward the documentation side of things. But it covers not only software technology, as you probably know, but also scientific and very abstract medical, a whole host of complicated and advanced topics. But it goes all the way from that end of the spectrum through the business and professional arena, various industries and fields and professions, and all the way to the academia and education side. So to the question about whether, for example, a tutorial is part of the under the umbrella of technical communication, absolutely. So my own career has traversed that same kind of arc from the technical arena, the manufacturing engineering arena, all the way through the business and professional arena. Now I mostly design instructional materials and videos and tutorials for clients in any number of different fields. So it's a wonderful, wonderful profession. And I just wanted to put that plug in because you can go from where you are to anywhere else you might want to go. It's up to your, your own fancy, what intrigues you and where you want to take your talents and skills.
Yeah, definitely. 100% agree with that. And this comes to Brian's initial question that he asked when we started, which was this is documentation for developers, but there's also this what is tech writing? And tech writing is a very broad field, just like you said, of people trying to share knowledge with other people. Until telepathy exists and we can just shoot knowledge from one brain into another, we will always have jobs as technical writers to try to facilitate knowledge sharing. And it's a huge broad field. So I tried to condense, as a developer, this is that small sliver of knowledge that you need to do the job.
Excellent.
I agree,
Peter,
100%.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Peter Marks, you had a question, comment.
I do. Jared, I've always imagined that most technical writers come from writers who become technical. If I understand right, you're describing your path was exactly the opposite, a technical person who became a writer. How hard do you think that is? Is that still something going on? It sounds like you're saying that you have lots of openings. Is that the kind of people you're hiring? I'm trying to understand the career path there. Most bakers are not good writers of cookbooks, probably, and so I'm curious about that.
That's fair. I mean, I always did writing, even when I was an engineer. So I guess I always kind of had it in me. But there's I think you stated well. There's a lot of us in the technical writer field at Google and at Waymo that are engineers or computer scientists or software developers who came over into technical writing. But there's also a large number of people, and I would say it's maybe 25% are like me, from a very technical background going into writing. And there's also maybe 70 to 75% of people from writing or other backgrounds like bioinformatics or the other sort of technical fields that end up in technical writing. And you do have to have some technical knowledge in order to communicate with the audience. The audience that we're generally communicating with is other developers who are integrating with Google services, or engineers, say at Waymo, who are trying to connect a lot of the systems that we're building or understand AI, or all sorts of technology that we use internally. So the technical bar is fairly high, but there's a number of people who have taught themselves programming and could come in and do the interview. Generally, for when we're interviewing technical writers, I generally look for people who can read code. I don't expect you to be able to write extensively, but can you read a small piece of code and ask questions about it and understand it? And generally that interview would take place with an engineer, where you would have the opportunity to ask questions back and forth, which is pretty similar to what you would do in your day-to-day job. I think there's some sort of there's often a lot of myths of the Google interview is incredibly brutal and highly technical. And the technical writer interview specifically tries to mirror the job very closely. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to me. I can definitely go deep with this.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Who else? If you guys don't, I got another one for him. Jeff?
Let's do it.
The format of publishing technical documents. So one of the things I do working with writers and authors is we publish books that have to be routinely updated. And because some people still like to have a physical copy or a Kindle copy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Just the updating of documentation.
Yeah, I mean, making it available in the different formats. We talked about going where your users are. So, I mean, if you wrote a book on LinkedIn, we've done 13 revisions.
Green, knock his cock off. Try to get away from me.
Gosh.
Big ass.
Hang on.
Case. Fucking have a case. Big ass.
Jeez. This is the first we've been Zoom bombed twice.
Wow.
Sorry, you guys. I reported them to Zoom. I'm sure that's something they get all the time.
This is my first Zoom meeting where that has ever happened. So
twice, actually, it's probably the same person. Yeah, and that has never happened before. So unfortunately, we are going to be using a registration process, which Bob will be happy to hear, because he wanted to make sure that for these tech brews going forward, that we do have a registration process. We don't charge a fee, but we want to know who's coming. Anyway, sorry, back to my question.
That's your question. I think, one, I want to make the distinction between sort of writing online for developers in this the technical writing capacity that I do, where I'm writing content that would end up at, say, android.google.com or developers.google.com or cloud.google.com. All of that content, the format for it is very different than a written published book, in that I am maintaining that on a regular basis. I am looking at it, evaluating the analytics, tweaking that content, making sure it aligns with new project launches. There's this regular cadence that I'm looking at that content, and it is churning and changing. Some of those pages only last a couple months, and then because we'll launch a feature, that feature will get updated, and I'll get rid of it. So yeah, so that format is different than publishing, and that's one of the reasons why when my co-authors and I wrote this book, we really avoided a lot of picking a specific set of technology that GitHub with Jekyll is the way to publish, or We do mention Google Analytics just because it's such a standard, but we try to avoid mentioning specific tools just to keep the book as future-proof as possible. But we also go way more in depth. And usually when you write a book, you tend to go far deeper, bringing in a lot more research, bringing in a lot more sort of guidance about why we made the decisions that we made, and also bringing in a narrative, like a story that's actually interesting for people to read. Because people are dedicating time to writing this, and I don't want to waste your time. I want this to be a good book that you enjoy reading, that you're willing to come back to on a regular basis. So that's something that you have to think about. I think when I publish online, I think a lot about maintainability because I'm like, I can always go back and fix this later. And that's also where good enough documentation is perfectly fine. Because if I get feedback that I should improve it in a specific way, great. But if I don't, that's fine too. It's good enough. I can move on. A book has to be great. You can't go back, like it's printed. Like
you're asking people to pay for it. It better be
right. Well, there's also like, it's like if there's an error in the book, you can't fix it. It's done. It's shipped. So that's
well, you can't with the model you went down. Yes.
Right. I can with the ebook. But I can,
you can submit that. Good.
I can update the ebook, but I can't update the print. So like you have to be very aware of when it has to be great, and then you also have to future-proof it by thinking about what you're going to publish, and making sure that you don't write about something that's going to be outdated or deprecated in a couple months.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. What other questions? And in your book, do you have some examples of sort of best of class documentation?
We generally avoided that. But I would say I am personally a fan of Twilio's documentation. I think it's excellent. I think Stripes. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted David Nunez, who's the lead of Stripes documentation team, to co-author the book is just because I really respect the content that they create. I think like their content really set the standard for how people document APIs in particular across the industry. I feel like every major company, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft have all shamelessly stolen their layouts for doing that because they're so good. I'll also, in addition to write the docs, I'll also plug the Good Docs project, which is an open source project that tries to take a lot of templates that a lot of these companies have generated and turn them into just an open source set of templates that anybody can use. Nice. So I would plug that. And there's a huge list of best practices, sort of best of class templates and doc sets in the book as well.
Excellent.
So I highly recommend those.
I've always
definitely the Good Docs project.
I like DigitalOcean. I think they do a really good job of.
Oh yeah, theirs are great. And I don't think anyone's been able to replicate the sort of doc bounty model that they have, which I think has been like really fascinating. I know they originally just had that, and they had developers writing their docs and a couple of editors. They eventually went to hiring technical writers because they had to. But
well, what a great way to build a portfolio, right?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good model. I like it.
And in fact, I didn't get that job at Amazon, but I'm curious about what burns tech writers out.
Ooh,
I guess if you have a bunch of really mean developers who are beating you up every day because you're not somehow communicating what was intended.
I think most developers, I've been treated very well, which is good. I think the hard thing is saying no. Like I was the first tech writer at Waymo. There's 2,000 engineers. So saying no becomes really important in teaching developers how to create documentation on their own, and then stepping in where I'm needed is absolutely critical to my success, and more importantly, my sanity. I think when I worked in Google Cloud and managed a large team there, it was, like I said no to more projects. But one of the interesting things at Google Cloud is that the tech writers had the ability to stop launches if they didn't think the documentation was actually of quality, specifically for like high visibility launches. And so we definitely did end up with some uncomfortable conversations with people who are like, we would like, you'd have like lead engineers like, I want to, like, we're launching this now, and I'm like, hey, the documentation is really poor. We should work on this. Like, I'm not stopping it for more than like say a couple days, but we should sit down and crank out some good docs. So that's where like you start to have some negotiation right around there. But I think it's a testament to the importance of content.
Yeah. In fact, that was the thing about Amazon is you have to not back down from conflict. And they define conflict much differently than I thought what conflict actually meant. They thrive on conflict because of what you just said. You have to be willing to sort of engage in those difficult conversations. All right, Brian Hildebrand has a question.
Hey, Jared, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting.
Yeah, no problem.
I think it sounds like you're trying to shy away a little bit from, naming any direct software that, or tools to write docs. But, is there any difference in the tools that you would select if you're writing for an, API or tutorial or software user guide, or for example, if the content changes rapidly and isn't as static?
As I said earlier, I would take a docs-like code approach. I mean, one of the reasons why I don't name a lot of pieces of software is because I think you should use what your developers are already using. For example, at Google, we just use the same source code control system that we use for code as we use for documentation. And that includes both internal and external documentation. We use a static site generator. That's Python based because tons of people know Python within Google. And that's what generates like the vast majority of external sites that you see: cloud.google.com, android.google.com, developers.google.com. At the Linux Foundation, everyone used GitHub. So we built, we used GitHub as our source, our source code control. And then on top of that, we used, some teams use Jekyll and liquid templates. In Kubernetes, we originally started in that direction, but we had a number of Go developers. So we switched to using Hugo for our static site generator. So I think like that's the route that I would choose to go. There's so many good static site generators out there that I would use the source code control system that you're already using, like Git, and then pick an appropriate static site generator that's not going to have a huge learning curve for your team. That's how I would go. Templates, I would use if you're going to go with Hugo, if you're going to go with Hugo, you have the option of using Doxy. So docsy.dev, which is a set of open source templates that you can just apply to Hugo, which is basically like Linux standard for a lot of the Cloud Native Compute Foundation doc sets that they wrote. But there's tons of options depending on. Oh, thanks, Brian. There's tons of options that you can run with, but I am a big fan of a docs-like code approach, using the source code control system that your team's already using, choosing an appropriate static site generator and templating system.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Karen, did you have a question? Nope, you just turned on your camera. Good to see you. Well, you guys, it's getting close to 6 o'clock. I know Jared's got a family and dinner and everything to get to. So I really appreciate, Jared, you taking time. Sorry about the Zoom bombers. That is a first at TechBrew.
I got to experience something new.
And, I was going to post this meeting on the Reddits for tech writers, which probably would have invited way more Zoom bombers, right? So I'm glad I didn't, because I might have been just squashing those things. There's no way, I'll look into it. It would be great if you could lock a Zoom meeting like after it starts, because these guys kept coming back on after I basically banned them. They just logged back on with a new account. Anyway, new experience. I'm going to go ahead and save the chat because there were some great comments in there, and I will make that available. And this was recorded, so I'm going to go ahead and make this recording available. Jared, I'll send you a copy as well. But from all of us at TechBrew, we're very grateful. And when you ever get down to San Luis Obispo, time it around the second Monday of each month, and we'll have you in person.
All right, sounds great. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Let me go ahead and stop recording.
Thank you.
All right.